I lived in eastern South Dakota, but we took vacations with my grandparents to the western part of the state where the fossils are found. And it just seemed like a natural question, and I couldn't believe no one had. Maybe people had wondered it, but no one ever bothered to investigate. So I guess that's when it started for me. Then when I went to Greece for the first time, I went to the island of Samos and working with my husband on topography, ancient Greek topography. So we were looking at fortresses and ancient roads. And I found out that there was a fossil museum in the middle of the island. So we rented motorcycles to go there and to get the key, this huge key from the postmistress, and she opened this room where they had all these gigantic bones, thigh bones as tall as I was. Some of them were covered in red dirt. Still, and I said, "What? Where did these come from?" Oh, farmers plow them up constantly. People digging wells, they find these. The farmers bring them in, and they still had the dirt on them. And I thought, what? Then they found them in antiquity, and no one's ever talked about it. I couldn't believe it. So that's when I began the serious collecting of all the ancient sources that I could find. But of course, they're not indexed. You have to read everything. And looking for accounts of finding giant bones, remarkable bones, teeth of enormous size, things like that. And that's before the internet, so I spent a lot of time in libraries. I had rapture the deep in libraries, just gathering all this information for myself. I had no idea of writing a book or doing anything with it. It was just my curiosity. Well, many people think of Augustus's museum on the island of Capri as the very first museum of both fossils and early artifacts, prehistoric artifacts. Suetonius, the historian who wrote Augustus's biography, says that Augustus started the first museum to show the bones of land and sea monsters and also the weapons of heroes. And if you talk to paleontologists and archaeologists on the island of Capri, you find out that indeed they could have found, when they were digging the foundation for Augustus's villa building there, if they're digging in the ground, they will find ancient prehistoric weapons of iron. They find them, and then you can go to the museum in Capri and see the very weapons that Augustus, the emperor, is showing the Roman people as the weapons of mythic heroes, because they're so that you can tell they're very old. Nobody uses them in his time either. And then the fossil or the bones, he said, were displaying the bones of monsters from the sea and land. Well, that whole area of Capri is has very rich deposits of Pleistocene fossils. So if they're digging foundations for his villa, they would have come across mammoth bones and teeth. And in fact, those are displayed today in a little museum in Capri together, those prehistoric weapons and the bones of monsters, and just as Augustus claimed. And of course, he's showing his power and how ancient the land is of Rome. But that is not the very first time that huge fossils, remarkable remains were displayed in antiquity. It goes all the way back to the 5th century BC, the time of Herodotus, when I think Herodotus is the very earliest account we have, documentation of someone deliberately digging in order to uncover or unearth prehistoric fossils, and it would have been of a mammoth or a mastodon, something like that, from the Pleistocene era. The story in Herodotus is that the Spartans wanted to become powerful in southern Greece. They went to the Oracle of Delphi and they asked, how can we become powerful? And the Oracle of Delphi said, well, not until you find your founding father or hero's bones and bring them back to Sparta. So they ponder this and they look everywhere. What would their hero's bones look like? Orestes was their hero. So they're looking everywhere, they never find anything. And then one day, a Spartan is visiting in the town of Tegea, and he's staying with a blacksmith, and the blacksmith's digging a well in his courtyard, and the blacksmith says, "Hey, look what I found in this well," because a well is a core sample of the earth, right? You're digging a core sample, just like paleontologists do. And he had these gigantic bones, and the Spartan says, "My God, that's got to be our founder's bones." Or he's thinking, those will do if I take those back to Sparta and we'll have power in the world. So he sneaks back later when the blacksmith is gone with a team. They dig up the bones, take them back to Sparta. They give them a huge burial in a fancy tomb in Sparta, and they announce that they now have the bones of Orestes, their founder. And of course, as Herodotus says, now they began to accrue power and became the Sparta that we know and hate. But I think that story really shows the power that these remarkable remains could give a nation or a city-state or the people who actually appropriate them. And in this case, they appropriated them from Tegea and stole them from that town, and showed them off as their founding hero. But that just started this bone rush. Now every city-state has got to get imposing bones that they can display as their founding hero. And Thebes, we know that Thebes went to the area around Troy, which is also a really rich fossil site, and they brought back some giant bones and said these belong to our founding ancestors. And Athens did the same thing. And soon every city-state had bones to show off as their impressive bones. I mean, 3 times the size of any human, of course. And they passed them off as heroes. And we don't know whether they really believe it or whether they're just using them for power, but probably a little of both. Then, of course, Augustus went to the city of Tegea hundreds of years later and stole a giant tusk from the temple of Tegea that had been shown off as the tusk of the giant boar that had ravaged the landscape and was killed by heroes. That had been in the temple of Tegea for hundreds of years, and it was important to their national or city pride. And Augustus took it back to Rome. It shows off his power that he can appropriate such important mythical artifacts, show them in Rome. When I was doing research for the fossil legends of the first Americans, I went to the Yale Peabody Museum in New Haven because I knew that they had a large collection of medicine bundles and amulets that contained fossils from Plains Indian tribes that had been taken from prisoners of war during the Indian Wars or from corpses, all stored in the basement of this museum, not on display. They gave me permission to study them and even photograph them. They, in fact, had published 1 or 2 photographs of them in their own publication back in the 70s. But now they kept in the basement and no one really knew they had them. But they allowed me to study them and take photos. And then and I wrote about the book. When I was writing about them in my book, I then asked for permission to reproduce a few of the photos that they had given me permission, and they refused. They said, we don't want the Crow tribe or the Lakota Sioux tribe to know that we have these, because they will request repatriation under NAGPRA. That is the law that we have now for repatriation of artifacts, sacred artifacts. So I said, but you published photos yourself of these. Well, things are different now. Oh. So I took the photos and I gave all my photos to the librarian on the Crow Reservation in Montana, in Crow Agency. And I talked with the elders there, and they said, this is good to know, but we don't want to repatriate them. It's good to know that they exist and where they are, but we don't want them back on the reservation because we have no idea what the power was. I'm getting chills when I talk about this because just to think that they knew that how much power they would have, but we don't know how to use that power. We don't know what power that individual who owned them, and we had the names of who owned them, but we don't know how they used them, what the ritual was for each amulet or medicine bundle, and it would not be good to have that kind of power in our reservation and be unable to control it, which I thought that was a very interesting, unexpected response. But I've run into it again, talking with other elders about whether or not to repatriate items of such power. Most of the fossils were ammonites, which is a spiral, which is a sacred symbol for lots of cultures. And just the fact that it is obviously a shell that has turned to stone, some magical way. So it is the fossil itself that has the power. And I did publish some photos of medicine bundles in that book, but they came from different museums that allowed me to publish the name of who owned it and identify each fossil that was in it. And in fact, that brings up another strange story from Yale University. I knew that one of the amulets I was interested in belonged to a famous chief from the Crow tribe who was a friend of Othniel Marsh, one of the paleontological pioneers from that time period during the Indian Wars. He went to the Dakotas and made friends with several of the Sioux chiefs and elders there who helped him find fossils. And he had an amulet that was an ammonite, and it was painted with red ochre. And it ended up in Yale University, but not in the Peabody Museum. It is in the biology collections of shells. And so I had to get permission to go to their drawers now in the biology department, and I pull out this drawer of shells, and there's this fossil in the middle with still some traces of red ochre on it. And as you say, no way to classify that. I had to depend on the expertise of so many paleontologists, but they were so nervous about me writing this book. They said, you don't understand. You are writing about the sacred meaning of fossils to Native Americans, and that will justify them reclaiming fossils as under the artifact laws, because it's not a man-made artifact, but it is imbued with sacred meaning, and so they could reclaim them. I don't know of any fossils that have been in the U.S. that have been requested, that the return has been requested and followed through, except for the example of Jack Horner and the baby T-Rex. And that was part of their agreement when he said, "I will put it together for you, and then give it back to you." That trust was already there. They didn't have to request the return. You take the meaning from the territory. You're unearthing what makes that land meaningful to the people who live there, and taking it away, it certainly has an effect. But it's also interesting that so many Native American traditional feelings against taking anything from the land. There's also that feeling. One reason why the nomadic plains people did not want to live on reservations or become farmers, especially didn't want to become farmers because that would be tearing into Mother Earth. It just seemed obscene to them that anyone should mine or farm, take things from the earth. And in fact, many of them were so strict you couldn't eat on a Navajo reservation. Have you ever been to Arizona? To a Navajo reservation? They actually punish children for picking up beads or small bones or any scraps of pottery from the ground. You do not take things from the ground. There's so much mining on Navajo land. And when I talked to the medicine man there, Harry Manygoats, he told me that they feel that it's extremely dangerous to dig into the land like the mining operations are doing, but also he was dubious about paleontologists taking bones out of the ground too, because they believe there's only a thin membrane of time separating each age. Thin membrane of time that separates each age and the flora and fauna that come from each age. And if you breach that membrane, then monsters will emerge from the earth. And of course, all the mining is bringing a lot of toxic pollution to their land. And if you go to South Dakota, the Journey Museum in Rapid City, they have asked local Native Americans to interpret the fossils according to their traditions. And so that's one of the few natural history museums where you'll see the fossils with the side-by-side Western scientific interpretation of the dinosaur fossils, and then the Native Americans' interpretation according to their traditions, which it's so important. If only they would, if only that would be reproduced everywhere. My favorite museum is the Cuvier Museum in Paris, in the Jardin des Plantes, the old museum from 1756 to 1806, because there, it's a real museum. You could discover something there. Every bone has dust this thick on it. It's the old labels from Cuvier, and you keep going back because you think you could discover something in the museum. That's what a museum should be, in my opinion. At the entry to the door are two huge mastodon femurs on either side. The one from von Humboldt, South America. The other was labeled from Jefferson. That's wrong. It's not from Jefferson. I know the curator. I think he has changed the sign. It's actually discovered by Abenaki Native Americans on the Ohio River. But they like to say von Humboldt and Jefferson. These new museums, like the Museum of the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., I was very excited about that museum. I don't know if you've ever been to it. It's a beautiful building. The building is the main reason that you would go there, and the fact that the building exists. Those are the two reasons to go there. They pick maybe 100 objects to show you, and they tell you what to think about it. And then they have all this horrible interactive stuff. I'm sympathetic to Jack Horner, the one that I mentioned. He was very helpful to me in the beginning, and I feel that he is acting responsibly and sensitively with Native Americans. He also, when he was building this museum that I was talking about, the Museum of the Rockies, the one that actually has the real bones, I told him how I felt about museums that hide everything that they own and only show you a few selected pieces. And he said, everything we own will be on display. He promised me that when he made the museum, and now everything is on display. And you can even watch everyone who's working on any bones in the museum. All the paleontologists you can see them, what they're doing. And so I am sympathetic to that sort of paleontology. I'm not sympathetic to the ones who thought that I shouldn't write my book because someone might want the bones back. So I'm not actually a scientist myself, and I had to depend on a lot of paleontologists to help me. But even in that community, some of them are very critical of me, and I'm critical of them. So I don't have total sympathy for all paleontologists. Certainly not for the ones that were first going out to the Dakotas and never even bothered to ask their guides what were the meaning of these bones. What's interesting to me is that I thought when I first started writing that book that I would have the most information from the time of the pioneer paleontologists who went to the Dakotas to dig dinosaur bones. Nothing. Complete blank. The further back I went, the more information I got from the Europeans who came. So, from the French who came to Canada, from the Spanish who went to South America and Latin America. They asked. Why? Because they didn't know what they were. They had no idea what these things were. Now paleontologists, and even in the 1870s, they thought they knew. We know more than the indigenous people who live with these every day. But back then, in the 1500s, 1600s, the Europeans were asking. They asked them a lot of questions, and they recorded what the local people said about the bones. So that was really shocking to me. I mean, now it makes sense. As soon as I realized that it was, of course, the further you go in time, the more Europeans thought they knew about the bones, so they didn't have to ask. The reaction of Johnson Holy Rock, the elder that I spoke to on the Pine Ridge, who said, why don't they just leave them in the ground? And you could actually have people look at them in the ground. What would be wrong with that? More respect for not only the ground, the matrix that they're in, the sediment, the land itself, but the creature itself. If you need to look at them, you could have some examples in the ground. And he went to a place in South Dakota near Hot Springs where they do show them that way. And he said, why don't you leave them here instead of putting them in a building, a square building? The famous site in America is a big bone lick on the Ohio River, where Longueuil, the French commander, was coming from Quebec down to New Orleans by river to fight the Battle of New Orleans, and he had many Native American guides with him, and he supposedly discovered the fossils, the mastodon fossils along the Ohio River. But if you read his journal, the Native Americans went hunting and they found the bones and brought them back to him and explained what they were and what they belonged to, and the water monster, the name of the water monster, and what these were. And each time I went, I was really nervous to interview these people because of the same reasons you're saying. What right do I have to take their story and tell it? So I would always preface, first thing I would say is, I don't want you to tell me any sacred knowledge. I'm not looking for that. I simply want to prove that you knew about these before Europeans came. And they would laugh and say, oh, there's a lot of stuff we're not going to tell you. And that always, I felt like we have established exactly what we're going to talk about. So, but I was always nervous about my appropriation of their story somehow. So, but of course, the other thing that they always said to me, along with, no one ever asked us this before, too bad you weren't here 3 generations ago, or just even last generation, because now all the kids are watching TV and they're not listening to the stories, and hardly anyone knows the old traditions. And